Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time viewers and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you our first look into the naval warfare that happens during the French Wars. Now, of course, we've covered the introductory video in our previous lesson. We went over what this era is generally like, how we have this incredibly tense rivalry between Britain and France, mainly over their big political differences. France has had this big revolution. They've removed their monarch, Louis XVI, from power, replaced it with a different style of government. Whereas Britain is a monarchy and therefore wants to defend their monarchist beliefs and therefore not allow the Republic to take over and infest their nation. Do make sure you check out that previous video to get up to speed on the background here. We're going to start with our naval warfare battles and then we're going to transition into the British perspective and what it was like on land for them. So without further ado, notepads and pens at the ready and let us begin. So, what we want to look at in today's lesson, some key objectives for us to follow, are really to understand the nature of naval warfare in the 1790s and 1800s. We're not going to look at the key contextual details, like precise battles and so forth, just yet. I want to really give us a background into what the war was like, what exactly does it mean to fight at sea with a fleet. It's very important we understand that. We also need to understand who exactly Horatio Nelson was and how he differed from other naval commanders in his era, because he had different tactics, different ideas about how he should treat his marines, and so on and so forth. The third key thing we're going to look at is then, of course, the actual naval conflict. This is something in our next video we're going to go look at in a lot of detail and see exactly how war was fought and how it really went as the British and French fought against each other in this roughly 15-year time span. And then, of course, we're going to finish with a big assessment piece on something called the Battle of Trafalgar. For many, this is the focal point that defined the naval war for this era. That's our outline for us. That's what we're going to be looking at in the following 3 videos in this series. Well, let us get on to the actual key detail, which is called looking at the nature of naval warfare. So it's very important that we start by actually exploring the types of ships that were used in this era, because they are different from what we've encountered in other warfares before. The biggest one we need to understand is that ships at this time has something called a rating system. Ships will be classified in different ways and have different names. They'd be first rate, second rate, third rate. And this, in its simplest terms, was determined by the number of guns that was carried on the ships. The most important of all was the ship of the line. The ship of the line is what dominates the European naval affairs, for not just here in the early 1800s, but have been doing so for roughly 3 centuries before. They were the largest seagoing ships, and they had to be capable of carrying huge cannons. And so because of that, they became known as ships of the line. The whole idea of having massive guns was that naval tactics were designed to utilize the firepower of these ships in a big, long line. We're going to talk about the methods of combat in just a minute, but it's important to understand the general belief is the ships that have the most guns are the most powerful at sea and therefore the most dangerous and effective in naval warfare. So quite typically, ships of the first rate would have 100 or more guns. So in this case, the ships of the line would be classified as that. The second rate would then have roughly 80 to 99 guns and so on and so forth. If you had at least 70 guns, then you were classified as a ship of the line. But of course, to be a first-rate ship of the line, you would have to have over 100 guns to do so. The next one would then be ships of the fifth and sixth rate, which were known as frigates. They were smaller and lighter, and they were made much more for scouting and protecting their trading vessels. Again, trade routes are a big important thing, especially for the British. They have this whole span around the world, from the East India Company to the Caribbean, and so they really want to protect that. And so having frigates and ship of the lines is very, very important to achieve that. There also were even smaller ships, such as corvettes, who were the smallest and lightest, and therefore would be tasked with maritime escorts. You had smaller as well, but typically these are the main ones you'll find in your fleet. You're going to have lots of ships of the line, lots of frigates, and they're the ones who are going to be conducting the most warfare for you. In naval battles, it's important to understand that casualties are going to be very, very high. However, ships are going to be rarely sunk. This is because the cannons they're going to fire with, they don't fire explosive artillery in the way that we looked at in the First World War. This is instead literally heavy smoothbore cannons. And so they could fire, they could smash through the wood and the hull of a ship and severely disable the vessel, typically trying to destroy its masts and its sails. By destroying those, you could stop the ship from moving and therefore escaping from your fleet. However, because most ships are, of course, made out of wood, many of them would not sink, and so it was very common for ships instead to be captured, repaired, and then reflagged by the ones who defeated them. So Britain was actually acquiring during this naval warfare a lot of enemy ships to repurpose and use for themselves. It's important to understand before the 1790s, Britain and the other nations, especially France and Spain, have undergone an industrial revolution. They've really invested heavily in the naval warfare. They understand that having them really invested heavily in shipbuilding. They understand that having the most ships means one is going to be most successful. And the British government, especially, has spent large sums of money on the Navy. In fact, the most of any nation at this time. But in doing so, it also means they're now leading the progress for them. They're pioneering the transfer from something called linstock into gunlock firing, for example. So typically with the cannons, you would have to stand there with a match, big pole, and light the cannon, ignite it, and let it fire. However, with the gunlock firing mechanism, the cannons were able to fire independently, and therefore this meant they could fire faster. Firing faster, especially when you have something like 100 cannons firing at the same time, was incredibly effective. As a quick fact, under Horatio Nelson's leadership, his seamen were able to fire their cannons, all of them, in just under 90 seconds. So literally faster than a cannon a second is being fired on a 100-gun ship of the line. Really impressive thing that they're pulling off. It's also worth mentioning as well, they also have coppering on their hulls as well. What exactly is coppering? It's this metal plating that gives them more protection and therefore provides them more reinforcement in case they're fired at by the cannons. Therefore, it really strengthens them and allows them to sustain a heavy toll when in combat. It's going to be no surprise as well, the Royal Navy is only going to grow in this era as well. Just a few quick facts for you to be aware of. In 1792, at the start, the British Navy had 135 ships of the line and 133 frigates. By the time we get to 1802, those numbers have risen to 202 and 277 respectively, nearly doubled on both fronts. The number of sailors is also going to massively rise as well, up from 16,000 in 1792 right up to 135,000 by 1802. So in a 10-year span, the ships also get faster. The wooden hulls are all now replaced with copper, and therefore they're faster, they're stronger, and they can remain at sea for even longer. But that's enough on our type of ships. Let's delve in now to the actual naval tactics that these ships were then employed under. So generally, the ships would follow two main ideas. The two main ideas were one known as the broadside firing method, and the less common pell-mell attack or raking would be deployed instead. So in effect, what it would be is the ships would move in formations. You would have line formations, they would travel in columns, and so they would move across throughout the sea, and then when they would encounter another naval fleet who they were opposing, they would then cross the T. This is literally where the ship would turn on its side and fire broadside. Because the whole idea is you imagine a ship's hull and what its shape is, you have more cannons on the side of your ship. So again, because as we established, he with the most guns is probably going to win. If you can turn your ship on its side, you can fire with all your guns at the same time, overwhelm the enemy fleet. It was also very common for the ships to support any sort of land engagements as well. So when an army was trying to breach a city or was attacking a port town, they would therefore move the fleet into position, take the port, and they could fire their cannons from a distance and severely damage the town or city they were firing into. Which, of course, by overwhelming them, would give the army on the ground a big advantage, allow them to come in and then overwhelm the land troops who were stationed there. But I do want to explain further about this, the difference between broadside and pell-mell attacks. It's a very important distinction we have to understand because for our series going forward, Horatio Nelson is a massive advocate for the pell-mell attack, which is why he differs from a lot of the other commanders in the era. A lot of them much more prefer to use the broadside style, whereas he wants decisive, chaotic battles, which the pell-mell allows. Let's explore that in a bit more detail. So I have two diagrams here. I do want to stress right from the off here, these are not to scale, but it gives us a rough idea of what exactly each method is trying to achieve. So on the left-hand side, we have the broadside style. The broadside, quite literally, as I said, you have the ships facing each other from side on, and so because the side on, as you can see with the diagram, the side is longer than the front and the back, and so it can fire all their cannons successfully into the opposing ships. However, the problem with this method of combat is it's quite indecisive. The ships stay very much far apart, and so because they don't only fire into one side of the ship, and it's very likely, as of course does happen throughout the era, that the ships they have this engagement, they fire at one another, when they can very easily retreat, easily move away from one another, go back to their opposing ports, resupply, repair, and go back and fight again. So it's always going to result in a stalemate most of the time, and it's not really decisive. This is where Nelson differed, and he really wanted to advocate the pell-mell style. Pell-mell, it wasn't a new idea. It had been used quite a bit in the American Revolutionary Wars, but it had kind of fallen out of fashion in this era, especially over the 1780s. And so through the 1790s, when Nelson grows and becomes a stronger and more capable commander, he begins to use his knowledge, use his position to advocate more for the pell-mell style. So the pell-mell is very, very aggressive. Rather than standing broadside and firing from a long distance, the pell-mell principle instead smashes into the opposing center. Your ships willingly I should add, forcefully move forward and they attack the center of the opposing line. This is very dangerous though, because as you can see, as the diagram hopefully demonstrates, the enemy's broadside is still perfectly open. So as your ships are moving forward, the entire onslaught of the enemy fleet's side cannons can just fire into you. So especially in this column arrangement I've got here, the two front ships are taking a big brunt of assault. You know, in theory, they should be absolutely destroyed. This raking, this getting up close to the enemy ships to unload your own vast cannons is very, very costly. You're going to lose the entire front edge of your fleet because they're being the ones who are going to be attacked for a long time, I should add, before they can even retaliate themselves. But Nelson advocated this for two key reasons. One, he trusted his men more than the others would do. He believed his men, as the Royal Navy, were the best trained, the most efficient, and so because of that, he truly believed as they were smashed through the centre, the enemy ships would not actually defeat them. Yes, they would take a few shots, yes, they would take some damage, but they would still be able to break into the centre and have massive success once they achieved it. And this brings on to the second reason why he would do it, because it was decisive action. Once, in theory, they broke through the center, this would disrupt the enemy's line completely, make it massively chaotic, massively disruptive. And so then once you have your enemy ships really close, with their broadside able to fire, suddenly you can blast all into them, you can encircle them, you can capture more ships, and it makes a very decisive battle. You're either going to lose this battle or you're going to win. High risk, high reward. And Nelson really, really bought into that for better or worse. So we are. Hopefully that makes it very clear the two different styles of attacks here. So one that prolongs the long game, one that's quite relatively safe, but is still relying on high cannon usage. But the other one is very decisive. It risked being destroyed in the early engagement for a massive payoff once it could smash through the center and take a decisive victory in the later parts of the engagement. But I've been saying this name for a lot now. I keep saying Horatio Nelson. I keep saying Nelson. Who is this man? Let's just get a bit of background about him to wrap up this first video. So Horatio Nelson, who is this gentleman? Well, to many historians, he is either a naval hero or a self-serving maverick, as you may have gathered from what I've said about him already. He likes to go against the grain. He likes to be different, likes to be bold and stand out. Now, why exactly is he considered one of Britain's most, if not the most, successful naval admirals and leaders in the history of the Royal Navy? Well, it's because he has quite a strong record. He's going to have many decisive victories over his time as commander. We're going to look at Aboukir Bay in 1798, otherwise called the Battle of the Nile, his battles in Copenhagen in 1801, other naval engagements as well against the French and Spanish, and perhaps his crowning moment, which is the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Nelson joined the Navy at just 13 years old, and he proved himself an instinctive hunter, quite fearless and very fixated on this idea of absolutely annihilating the enemy, never questioning his ideas. He was quite headstrong, and before he was 21, he already to the rank of captain of a ship, with his courage and ability to win battles despite breaking orders proving quite impressive. In fact, he was so impulsive he actually would lose an eye and an arm during his naval engagements. He was also quite bullish. He would openly loathe his superiors, who were forced to concede that he indeed was a natural leader when, in the many battles he went against their orders, he actually, if not succeeded, actually made the battle even more decisive a victory for the British Royal Navy. Something that was very distinct to his leadership style was he was very, very charismatic. In an era when many leaders were using something called a cat o' nine tails to whip their men and beat them into action on the ships, Nelson didn't really advocate for that. He instead believed in this idea of a band of brothers. He even admired the actions of his men, and therefore insisted on having their ideas. He wanted their opinions, he wanted their views on how they would attack, how they would defend, and therefore, what we can say about him is that he valued teamwork above all else. And so he was very much a man ahead of his time who understood perhaps the best way to get the best out of your men wasn't to beat them, perhaps to praise them, understand them. And so he fostered this idea of a band of brothers. He famously called his men that who he served with. This actually comes from William Shakespeare's The Henriade. And so he actually really advocates that idea, understands that all going into battle together, and therefore it's not him who defines the Navy, but it is the Marines who he fights alongside. He also trusts his commanders to act independently. We're going to see he works very well with someone called Collingwood, and therefore they have many naval engagements together. And so while Nelson is above him in rank, he trusts Collingwood to act independently. And this actually is very, very effective during the Battle of Trafalgar, especially. As always in my series, you can certainly learn more about Nelson and the tactics we've explored today by checking out my further reading that is in the description box below. Throughout the series, as always, I'm going to be advocating to put in further reading there. But again, it's important to understand what I'm giving you here is just an overview, just an introduction. Again, it's on you if you want to learn more about this. So there we are. That's our introduction to this series. We've gone over some tactics, we've gone over the type of ships, and we've gone over a bit of background into who Horatio Nelson is. So in our following video, we're going to explore the battles that took place in this era, particularly in the 1790s and early 1800s. Do make sure you subscribe. Do make sure you are following, you are liking and commenting. I do appreciate your engagement as always in this series. What's one interesting thing you've learned so far? Are you excited to learn more about how these tactics and ships are going to be used in the battles going forward? Very good. As always, I thank you all for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.